The issue of women's rights began over 2 centuries ago, starting with 2 women, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, meeting at the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention. This encounter led to the founding of the women's rights movement. The women's rights movement lasted for almost a century, starting with the Seneca Falls Convention, the formation of the National American Women's Suffrage Association to the passage of the 19th Amendment, allowing women to vote in 1920. While the conflict of the women's rights movement reached a compromise of equal voting rights, the 19th Amendment, the conflict of equal rights still continues today. The birth of the women's rights movement started with the Seneca Falls Convention, the first women's rights convention organized by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Introduced to the matter by Susan B. Anthony, who mainly focused on the temperance movement at the time, and would later on work together with Stanton to fight for the rights of women and blacks, leading to the passage of the 13th Amendment. The convention promoted the ideals of social, civil, and religious conditions and rights of women. The turnout of this convention turned out bigger than expected, considering the time period of this event, 1848. This convention lasted for a total of 2 days, where in the first day it was invite only, meaning only women who were invited were allowed to attend. However, it was open to the general public for the second day, concluding with a total of 300 attendees, comprising of both women and men, including African-American abolitionist Frederick Douglass. In this convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton presented the Declaration of Sentiments and Grievances, modeled after the Declaration of Independence, comprising of details of the injustice dealt among women in America, encouraging the people to organize and petition for their rights. This convention concluded with the adoption of the Declaration of Sentiments and Grievances by the Assembly that passed the 12 resolutions, 11 of them unanimously, that called for the specific rights for women. Although the Seneca Falls Convention was not the first effort to support women's rights, suffragists today view this event as the launch of the women's rights and suffrage movement. Following the Seneca Falls Convention, for the next 50 years, women suffragist supporters worked together to educate the public on the matter of validity of women's suffrage. Many prominent female leaders emerged during this movement, including Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Lucy Stone, Ida B. Wells, and other women's rights pioneers. During this time, women reformers in the Club and Settlement House movement wanted to pass reform legislation, but since this was a disenfranchised group, the politicians ignored their words. Since voting equals power, this led to the women's suffrage movement to become a mass movement. 2 organizations were formed in support of this effort: the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA, founded by Carrie Chapman Catt, Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and the National Women's Party, founded by Lucy Burns and Alice Paul, NWP. While the NAWSA was a moderate organization, the NWP was a militant organization. Elizabeth Cady Stanton took the role of president in the NAWSA. The honor led Stanton to leave on a 2-year European speaking tour after being elected, leaving Susan B. Anthony, vice president at the time, to become the acting president. The NAWSA took matters through campaigns to enfranchise women in individual states, and simultaneously lobbied President Wilson and Congress to pass the Women's Suffrage Constitutional Amendment. They also used celebrities to support their cause to gather attention. The NWP took action through radical means, as picketing the White House in order to convince Wilson and Congress to pass the Constitutional Amendment. With the combined efforts of hunger strikes, force feeding, and other protests led by the NAWSA and NWP, the Congress ratified the 19th Amendment in 1920, enfranchising women. This victory won is considered as one of the most significant achievements of women in the Progressive era, and is known as the single largest extension of democratic rights in U.S. history through peaceful democratic process. Conflict of women's voting rights reaches compromise of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. The matter of equal rights is still at large. African Americans are in their ongoing battle for equal rights, even after the ratification of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery in America. The Civil Rights Movement was a mass protest against segregation and discrimination, advocating equal rights for African Americans. Today, many of the leaders we learn in our classroom emerged from this era, as Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and other activists. During Reconstruction, Black gained power and took leadership roles like never before, wanting to change legislation on equality. Even though the 14th and 15th Amendment were ratified, giving African American protection and power to vote, whites still found methods to prevent the blacks from gaining more power, as the Jim Crow laws, causing for segregation. These laws weren't accepted in the northern states, but African Americans still felt the discrimination when applying for jobs and buying houses. Additionally, Southerners used the grandfather clause and literacy test to prevent blacks from voting. Southern segregation gained more power, and U.S. Supreme Court declared separate but equal under Plessy v. Ferguson. Protests, boycotts, and sit-ins were put into action. The March on Washington is inarguably one of the most famous protests in the Civil Rights Movement, promoting equal job opportunities. Organized by civil rights activists A. Phillips Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and Martin Luther King, where he presented his famous I Had a Dream speech, opening up the doors to many African Americans when President Franklin Roosevelt made an executive order to open up national jobs for all Americans regardless of race. Rosa Parks made a major contribution to gaining equality. Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her bus seat to a white male. This ignited outrage and support, not only from African Americans but whites as well. The Montgomery bus boycott started. People boycotted the buses for 381 days until segregated seatings were declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court. Nonviolent protests ultimately led the campaign to become successful, passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, forbidding discrimination in public places and job employment. The Voting Right of 1965, suspending any voter qualification test. Today, majority of Americans falsely believe that the Constitution guarantees women equal rights. This issue is not only happening in America but also internationally. Unlike the women's rights movement, this battle is more symbolic. Jobs have implications regarding gender-based violence and workplace sex discrimination, creating a gender imbalance in top leadership roles. Even homosexuals, major corporations discriminate against them, refusing to give them equal opportunity due to their sexual orientation. The idea of women or homosexuals being in leadership positions break people's belief in tradition. Leadership should not be based on gender or sexual orientation but on qualification. Saudi Arabia is one of the worst countries for women's rights. Without male guardianship, women in Saudi Arabia are unable to marry or divorce, access healthcare, and many more. Living in a patriarchal society, a woman's testimony in court is half of a male, equivalent to a minor. Even many public facilities are separated by gender. While injustice is apparent, over the years, women in Saudi Arabia are gaining more rights as driving and working, having formal restriction on women's work removed. As the conflict of equal rights reaches compromise, new issues are always arising. The women's rights movement reaches compromise with the 19th Amendment, and the conflict of civil rights movement reaches compromise with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Act of 1965. The conflict in modern society still continues, but protests are made, laws are changing for the better, implements are being made. With the conflict of equal rights popping up one after another, compromises are popping up right along with it, leaving the society better than the one before.